Well, we're going to get started. The ranking member is on his way. The reason for the early hearing is we have votes, and people go back to the districts today, so I wanted to make sure I got this hearing in. So I'm going to begin. Other members will be walking in as the hearing is progressing. Well, this hearing will come to order. This hearing, entitled Assessing U.S. Security Assistance to Mexico, will focus on evaluating the extent to which U.S. assistance under the Merida Initiative has been effective in strengthening Mexico's justice sector institution, combating crime, and protecting human rights. Without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, and strenuous materials for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. I will now make an opening statement and then turn it over to the ranking member for his opening statement. Before I open with my statement, I want to thank everybody that's here. It's early, it's miserable outside, and I certainly want to thank the witnesses for being here. Good morning, everyone, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. In reading the news over the last few weeks, the shocking headlines from Mexico have been impossible to escape. Last week, I saw that kids as young as 6 years old are arming themselves to defend their families in a rural part of the Guerrero state. As cartels have sought to assert control over the area, the murder rate has doubled, and the community has nearly shut down. Kids who should be in school learning math and science are instead learning how to fire shotguns and ambush armored vehicles. As a former teacher, I believe that nothing is more sacred than the investment we make in our children's future. It broke my heart to think that these kids are being deprived of their rights to learn and grow free from violence and fear. And we know that what is happening in Guerrero is just a microcosm of the broader trends we are seeing across Mexico. Mexico's homicide rate has reached its highest level in decades. Targeted attacks against journalists, human rights defenders, and local public officials have continued at rates higher than almost anywhere in the world. A recent report from the International Federation for Journalists found that Mexico is the deadliest country in the world for journalists. Of the 49 journalists killing it documented in 2019, 10 were in Mexico. Most journalist murders, like most homicides in Mexico, are never solved. I have long advocated for robust U.S. assistance to help Mexico strengthen its democratic institution, combat corruption, defend human rights, and improve security. I believe that Mexico and the United States have a shared responsibility to reduce violent crimes and improve quality of life for those living on both sides of our border. The United States must enact stricter gun laws, dedicate more resources to combating money laundering by the cartels, and increase investment in programs to reduce domestic demand for illegal drugs. But we also expect a sincere commitment on the Mexican side to reducing this violence. I appreciate the efforts that Mexico's security forces are making, but they are being outgunned by these brazen and well-resourced cartels. A Mexican civil society organization called Common Cause released a report this week showing that 953 police officers have been murdered in Mexico in just the past 2 years. I admire those courageous individuals who are putting their lives on the line, but it is clear that substantial political commitment is needed to address the underlying problem of impunity and corruption which are perpetuating the violence in Mexico. Now is the time for the U.S. government to look critically at our assistance programs to determine what is working and what is not. I am eager to hear from the State Department and USAID about our strategy and how Congress can measure tangible progress under the Mérida Initiative. I sincerely hope that the Trump administration is prioritizing security in our engagement with Mexico, rather than pressuring Mexico to use the National Guard to prevent desperate people from migrating. I know that many of my colleagues share my frustration that we have not made more progress under the Mérida Initiative. I hope that this hearing will help us develop a clearer sense of what next step we should take. I look forward to working with my colleagues and with the executive branch on a bipartisan basis to explore solutions to these difficult challenges. Thank you, and I now turn it over to Ranking Member Rooney for his opening statements.
Thank you, Chairman Cyrus, for holding a second hearing to follow up on this very important and timely issue regarding the security situation in Mexico. The relation with Mexico is among the most strategically important relationships for the United States. We're linked by geographic proximity, as well as economic, historical, and cultural ties. And the events occurring in Mexico directly impact our country. Recent years have brought widespread violence, criminality, and a deteriorating security condition in Mexico, which has been largely driven by the drug cartels. Can't ignore the fact that the paper today had the article about the children in Guerrero. So cooperation is a critical component of our relationship with Mexico, and it's important that we review security conditions there and our assistance programs to identify what has been most effective and what has been ineffective in assisting the country to address its security challenges. I'm concerned that recent events in Mexico have resulted in the deaths of 9 U.S. citizens, including 3 children, at the hands of the Mexican drug cartels. These events reflect the continued security challenges which Mexico faces and the need for both the United States and Mexico to take steps together to address them. Through intimidation, extortion, corruption, and pervasive violence, the Mexican people are terrorized daily. The López Obrador administration is taking steps to have a newly created Mexican National Guard take the lead on security. This force has also supported some immigration enforcement. Much work remains to properly train and equip them, and questions remain about other steps the Mexican government can take to address the security challenges. Despite the efforts of previous Mexican administrations to combat the cartels and address security, 2019 saw a 30% increase in Mexico's homicide rate, much of which driven by these drug-related crimes. Further, the cartels have expanded their drug trade to supply the surge in U.S. demand for methamphetamine, heroin, and synthetic opioids. I suggest anyone interested in this topic read the book Dreamland about the Nayarit drug gangs. We must also acknowledge the flow of illegal weapons from the United States to Mexico, especially assault weapons and high-powered weapons, which contribute materially to the violence, along with the systemic corruption, impunity, and lack of rule of law. Since 2007, under the Mérida Initiative, the United States has provided roughly $3 billion in security assistance to Mexico. Mexico, of course, has also contributed much more. From 2014 to 2018, U.S. security assistance has focused on the rule of law, anti-corruption, and human rights in Mexico. The Trump administration has added focus on attacking the financing of the cartels and combating the increased trade in opioids and synthetic drugs, which I think is a positive step. Yet the United States and Mexico must continue to work together to improve existing security infrastructure and ensure that regional security priorities are addressed. It's also critical that the Mexican government communicate to us what they are doing to address the problem and present a comprehensive security strategy that U.S. assistance can support. For its part, the United States should explore ways to modernize the security assistance provided under Mérida, and we need continued intelligence sharing, capacity building, and the provision of technology and equipment. We should also review our coordination on the border about security, where we can support Mexico's efforts to carry out inspections and screenings. The U.S.-Mexico security relationship has come a long way, but we must continue to build our relationship on a foundation of mutual trust and cooperation. This is a joint responsibility and serves the interests of both countries to do so. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, our career Foreign Service officers, for being here today, and I look forward to hearing the testimony.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ranking Member Rooney. I will now introduce Mr. Hugo Rodriguez, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs. Mr. Rodriguez is a career Foreign Service officer who most recently served as Deputy Chief of Mission in Paraguay. He previously served as the Consul General at the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City, and later as Missions Acting Minister for Consular Affairs. Mr. Rodriguez, we welcome you to the hearing. We will then hear from Mr. Richard Glenn, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs. In his current role, Mr. Glenn oversees the Office of Anti-Crime Programs and Western Hemisphere Programs. He began his work with the INL in 2011 as Deputy Director of the Mérida Initiative in Mexico City and has also served in Ecuador and Argentina. Mr. Glenn, thank you for joining us today. Welcome. Finally, we will hear from Ms. Barbara Feinstein, Deputy Assistant Administrator in USAID's Bureau of Latin America and the Caribbean. Feinstein oversees USAID program in Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean. A career member of the Senior Executive Service, she was previously Deputy Assistant Administrator for Legislative and Public Affairs and served as the Deputy Chief of Staff to Administrator Rajiv Shah and Chief of Staff to Acting Administrator Alonso Fulham. Ms. Feinstein, thank you for joining us today. I ask that the witness please limit your testimony to 5 minutes, and without objection, your prepared statements will be made as part of the record. Mr. Rodriguez, we recognize you first for your testimony.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Rooney, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss U.S. bilateral security cooperation with Mexico. I must also thank the U.S. Congress and this committee in particular for its consistent, bipartisan, strong support of the U.S.-Mexico relationship in general and the Mérida Initiative in particular. While our bilateral agenda in Mexico covers a wide array of issues, including trade and commercial relationships, illegal immigration, educational exchanges, and efforts to create a more competitive partnership in a globalized world, security cooperation has always been the central element of that agenda. The United States and Mexico are essential partners in confronting the transnational criminal organizations operating on both sides of the U.S.-Mexico border. These TCOs and their subsidiaries have engaged in unprecedented levels of violence and pose a fundamental challenge to Mexico and its people. They are also a major threat to the United States. We must take a comprehensive approach to attack these TCOs, including the targeting of their business model, from production and trafficking of illicit drugs to their illicit finances and revenue. This is critical for the safety of all of our citizens. The necessity of our cooperation has been made even clearer over the past few months with the horrific murders of 9 American citizens on November 4, 2019 in Bavispe, Sonora, and the failed operation to arrest Ovidio Guzman in Culiacan in October of 2019. These events are in addition to the many lives of Mexican security forces and citizens that continue to be lost in the fight against TCOs. The Trump administration is committed to working with Mexico to combat these organizations. In just the last month, Attorney General Barr, the Director of the National Drug Control Policy Office, Carroll, U.S. Customs and Border Protection Deputy Commissioner Perez, and Acting Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs, Kozak, have all separately visited Mexico to discuss our joint efforts and the ways we can increase our collaboration to more effectively confront this threat. Transnational criminal organizations traffic Mexican heroin, methamphetamine, fentanyl, and Colombian cocaine to the United States. To address these and related threats, the United States and Mexico partner through the Mérida Initiative to support Mexico's efforts to improve security, reduce drug production and trafficking, enhance criminal prosecutions and the rule of law, build public confidence in the justice sector, improve border security, reduce irregular migration flow, and promote greater respect for human rights. U.S.-Mexico security cooperation has been expanding and evolving since the Merida Initiative was launched in 2008 and is based on the recognition and commitment that our countries share responsibility for combating transnational criminal networks and protecting our citizens from the crime, corruption, and violence they generate. The Merida Initiative is founded on mutual respect and reflects our understanding of the tremendous benefits derived from collaboration. U.S. assistance has provided crucial support to the Mexican government in its efforts to build the capacity of its rule of law institutions while enhancing cooperation between the U.S. and Mexican governments through provision of equipment, technical assistance, and training. The Merida Initiative also enables greater cooperation between U.S. and Mexican law enforcement agencies, prosecutors, and judges as they share best practices and expand their shared capacity to track criminals, drugs, arms, and money. President López Obrador has made the reduction of violence the key goal of his security policy and has pledged to fight corruption in Mexico. To advance efforts to combat our shared security challenges, the United States and Mexico have developed a new bilateral structure, the Mexico City-based High-Level Security Working Group. Under the umbrella of the HLSWG, we have jointly developed bilateral working groups to tackle issues of the highest importance. These working groups focus on drug policy, migration, illicit finance, cybersecurity, armed forces, emergency response, justice sector, and arms trafficking. Through these groups, we are identifying priorities and specific actions we can take together to make progress in each area. For example, we're looking at ways we can increase joint efforts to combat synthetic drugs and illicit drug production, increase drug interdictions and TCO prosecutions, and stem illicit finances. We are also working to reduce the number of illicit firearms, weapons, and the quantity of ammunition crossing the U.S.-Mexico border. The continued threat posed by transnational criminal organizations to both Mexico and the United States requires our continual support. Bilateral cooperation must continue, and the Merida Initiative provides a comprehensive, flexible framework through which our partnership can move forward to the benefit of both Americans and Mexicans. Let me turn the microphone over to my colleagues, and then I'll be happy to answer any questions you have. Thank you.
Mr. Glenn, we will now hear from your testimony.
Chairman Sirius, Ranking Member Rooney, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss our efforts with Mexico. The mission of the Department of State's Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs is to keep Americans safe by countering crime, illegal drugs, and instability abroad. We've provided assistance for the last 12 years under the Merida Initiative to build Mexican interdiction, law enforcement, and prosecutorial capacity. Our assistance has two principal purposes. First, to stop illicit drugs before they reach the United States. And second, to improve Mexican capacity to dismantle each component of transnational criminal organizations' business model, from drug production to trafficking to their illicit proceeds, and hold them accountable for their crimes. Despite the news that U.S. drug overdoses are finally on the decline for the first time in 20 years, more than 67,000 Americans died in 2018 overdosing on drugs, many of which come from Mexico. Mexico is the source of most heroin and methamphetamine consumed in the United States and is a major transit zone for cocaine and synthetic opioids like fentanyl. Meanwhile, in Mexico, Mexicans face their own epidemic, an epidemic of violence with the homicide rate hitting a record high of 29 per 100,000 inhabitants in 2019. Impunity is high, public trust in police is low, and organized crime erodes government institutions through corruption. Meanwhile, the Mexican government continues to consolidate its transition to the accusatorial justice system with some progress, but major growing pains. In the face of these challenges, the Merida Initiative has better positioned U.S.-Mexico security cooperation to confront the evolving drug threat, tackle corruption and security, and build trust between U.S. and Mexican law enforcement. INL has learned, and we have adapted our programs to meet the changing environment, tackle priority issues for changing U.S. and Mexican administrations, and prioritize sustainability and measurable impact. Where there is sustained Mexican political will, we have seen our investments bear fruit. One example, the more than 400 canines donated since 2011 have helped to interdict over 23 tons of narcotics. It includes fentanyl, it includes more than 56,000 guns, and millions of dollars in smuggled cash. We've since expanded the canine program to state police and corrections partners. And our next step is working closely with Mexico to develop a strategic plan for the deployment of canines to targeted locations to increase seizures and save more lives. We've learned that no amount of equipment or training can reduce impunity absent sustainable institutional improvements. This requires continued political will, resources, and urgency to tackle today's immediate problems while laying the foundation for an enduring culture of lawfulness and accountability. We are under no illusion that we have substantively reduced the number of drugs entering the United States or the level of violence in Mexico. We have a long road ahead. Yet, U.S. investments, when fully embraced and leveraged by Mexico, yield improvements that can add up over time. We seek opportunities to make the greatest impact for our investment while mitigating risk and ensuring sustainability. On the campaign trail and throughout his first year in office, Mexican President López Obrador has repeatedly vowed to take aim at transnational criminal organizations by combating illicit finance, corruption, and arms trafficking. With Mexico's explicit commitment, we have an opportunity to more effectively tackle our shared threat. Mexican political will must be backed by action and resources, and those will only make a measurable difference if they are deployed in a strategic manner with identified targets. We welcome the recent actions by the government of Mexico in the wake of the visit by Attorney General Barr and look to build on this momentum. INL is well positioned to bolster Mexican capacity to tackle our shared threats, but our assistance is only effective when tailored to complement Mexico's own strategic efforts. INL continues our important work in Mexico at a difficult time that calls for urgency. I'll be the first to acknowledge that current statistics make it hard to argue we are making headway. Nonetheless, these sobering numbers are exactly why we must continue to work closely with Mexico. We engage at every level to ensure our programs are matched with committed partners in the Mexican government, and we encourage Mexico to take a strategic approach to our shared challenges. And we will continue to do so, for the enduring and significant change we seek requires nothing less. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Ms. Feinstein?
Chairman Sidis, Ranking Member Rooney, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to discuss USAID's work in Mexico under the Merida Initiative. Since 2008, USAID has partnered with the Department of State and other U.S. agencies to address the crime, justice, and corruption challenges that undermine Mexico's stability and threaten our mutual security and prosperity. Under the Merida Initiative, USAID works to strengthen justice institutions, address corruption and impunity, protect human rights, reduce crime and violence, and build transparency. Undoubtedly, as you and as my colleagues have clearly articulated, the challenges before us are both enormous and daunting. And that is why USAID is clear-eyed and laser-focused on those areas where we have credible partners willing to work with us to exhibit the necessary political will to enact systemic change. And as I've outlined in my written testimony, we are seeing tangible results in each of the areas in which we work, results that we will continue to press the federal, state, and local governments to replicate. On rule of law, we are supporting the Mexican government to carry out a seismic shift in its judicial system, moving from a presumption of guilt to a presumption of innocence. Working primarily at the state level, where the vast majority of crimes are tried, we are providing demand-driven support to prosecutors, judges, investigators, and defense attorneys to implement protocols and procedures to build more effective cases and secure prosecutions. This is a long-term endeavor, but we are seeing progress. In the states of Chihuahua, Coahuila, Zacatecas, Nayarit, and Tabasco, our work has helped to increase prosecutions of felony crimes by 400 to over 700%. And in a similar set of states, our support to specialized homicide units has increased the number of indictments for homicides by 47%. So why is this significant? Because it provides evidence of what can be done when sufficient political will, resources, and capacity are marshaled toward a set of shared outcomes. The systems we are putting in place at state levels will be the foundations on which the entire justice system will grow and function. And for that reason, USAID is intentionally focusing and concentrating our programs under MERIDA in 13 specific states where we see unique promise and partnership. And we are applying those same principles to our work in anti-corruption and crime and violence prevention. With regard to Mexico's national anti-corruption system, we have purposefully shifted our resources to supporting state-level special anti-corruption prosecutors and civil society. And we are seeing tangible results here as well. In Coahuila, USAID's support to the Special Prosecutor for Anti-Corruption resulted in a 267% increase in the number of investigations closed. And in Jalisco, our support led to charges being filed in connection with 10 criminal organizations, a 400% increase over the baseline. With regards to crime and violence prevention, USAID has also sharpened our geographic focus. We are working in 10 of the government of Mexico's 27 priority cities for reducing violence, where we see evidence of political will, a pledge to invest their own resources, and a commitment to using data and evidence to inform crime and violence prevention. And here we are also seeing encouraging impact. The recidivism rate for incarcerated or paroled youth USAID works with is just above 3% compared to the national rate of 60%. Finally, with regard to human rights, and specifically the untenable levels of violence perpetrated against human rights defenders, journalists, and others, USAID is partnering with the government of Mexico to improve its ability to prevent, investigate, and prosecute human rights abuses, while also strengthening civil society to hold the government accountable. USAID supports Mexico's National Protection Mechanism, which provides protective measures to more than 1,162 journalists and human rights defenders. We are also helping to reduce the backlog of unsolved disappearances and to bring closure to criminal cases. USAID is supporting experts to identify the remains of victims and build forensic evidence for prosecution against the perpetrators. And on that note, we are very encouraged by the Mexican government's recent announcement of an extraordinary mechanism for forensic identification to deal with the disappearance crisis and look forward to expanded cooperation in this space. In conclusion, against an extraordinarily challenging landscape, we are seeing signs of progress that can be scaled up and replicated, provided the political will and sufficient resources exist to do so. Chairman Cires, Ranking Member Rooney, members of the subcommittee, thank you again for the invitation to testify. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, and we will now turn to questions. I will start it by asking, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, I was taken aback to read that children are forming armed groups to defend the community in Guerrero. Ms. Feinstein, Mr. Rodriguez, Mr. Glenn, can you provide examples of U.S. programs that have been effective in reducing violence and weakening the cartels at the local level, both in urban and rural communities? Mr. Glenn, we'll start you, put you on the hot seat first.
The Merit Initiative programs in terms of rural communities have focused primarily on increasing the ability of police to do their jobs at both the federal and the state level. We've generally avoided local police for various reasons. The professionalization of the police is essential, taking them from basically no or very little academy support and academy training at the beginning to now more professionalized policing ensures that they, at least at the beginning, have that kind of the support and know-how to do their jobs. Obviously, there's a lot more to do. The transition now with the federal police turning into the National Guard, along with pieces of both the Marines and the Army, it's going to be key that they take on that training and deploy into those regions. And I think, as far as we understand the purpose of the National Guard, it is to get out into those rural areas and help secure those communities that desperately seek that peace and stability.
Ms. Feinstein.
From USAID's perspective, as I mentioned in my testimony, we are focused on targeted municipalities that have the highest level of violence, including ones that the government of Mexico has specifically targeted. And our approach is to look at where we have partners that are willing to invest their own resources and where we see that political will. We're employing a variety of approaches to crime and violence prevention. So in certain municipalities, we have a model called civic justice. It's similar to community courts that exist in the United States, for example, where we will look at misdemeanors, for example. And for youth that are committing these crimes, we know through evidence that that can often be escalated and lead to more sophisticated levels of crimes. If we can address that, build confidence in the system, and strengthen the social fabric between the community, between local law enforcement, the municipal government, and the justice system, then we think we can pave a foundation for stronger rule of law at the local level. We are also not working in rural areas. In addition, as I referenced in my testimony, we are working with youth who are already in conflict with the law. So those are youth who have been in prison and or are on parole. And that is where, as I've said, through our techniques such as cognitive behavioral therapy, family counseling, working with youth before they exit prison to have a more successful reintegration in society, we are seeing very striking levels of lower levels of recidivism, around 3% compared to the 60% national average.
Thank you. Would you like to add something, Mr. Rodriguez?
I'll defer to my colleagues who can speak more knowledgeably to the programs themselves, sir.
Last year, 21 human rights defenders and 10 journalists were killed. In 2012, the Mexican government created a mechanism to protect human rights defenders and journalists. But since August 2017, at least 6 beneficiaries have been murdered. What needs to be done for the killing of journalists and human rights defenders to actually be investigated and prosecuted? Mr. Rodriguez.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, you point to one of the biggest crises that we believe faces Mexico, both upholding the standards of human rights as well as protection of journalists. This is something that we have raised frequently with the government of Mexico. My belief is that they share that concern. I can defer to Rich and to Barbara about the programs we have in place that are helping to strengthen those efforts. But I would say that both for us and for the government of Mexico, this is a priority. And we have seen them take steps to address both the protection of journalists and human rights in general.
Mr. Glenn?
I'll defer to Barbara on the specifics on programs that specifically focus on journalists and human rights defenders. In general, our efforts with both state level and federal level attorney generals and the investigative branches of law enforcement are to focus on increasing their ability to collect forensic evidence so that they can produce prosecutions. So that doesn't prevent the aggression against journalists, but when it does happen, ensures that the Mexican government can get justice.
And briefly, I would add that from USAID's perspective, we're working on this issue from a number of different fronts. One is we're providing technical assistance and support to the National Protection Mechanism, as I mentioned earlier, that provides actual protective measures from panic buttons to residential security upgrades to protection teams for journalists, and we are connecting journalists to that mechanism so that they can take advantage of those services as they exist. In addition, on a more structural and fundamental level, we are also providing support to the Special Prosecutor's Office for Crimes Against Freedom of Expression so that they can strengthen their protocols, strengthen investigations to be able to go after the perpetrators who are so viciously going after journalists. And then lastly, we do also provide direct support to journalists in terms of assistance with digital security, how they can protect themselves online, what methods they can take to be more secure.
Thank you. Congressman Rooney?
Thank you, Chairman Suarez. I'd like to start with Ms. Feinstein. I have 2 basic questions. One is, can you give us a little more specifics about how the AID programs have evolved under the Merida initiative and about our participation versus Mexico's? And then what judicial reforms do we need to execute in Mexico to increase convictions and prevent the prolonged legal proceedings of the cartel members? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. In terms of the evolution of our programming, so at the beginning of the Merida Initiative, as we've talked about, Mexico has embarked on this seismic shift to transform their judicial system from one with a presumption of guilt to a presumption of innocence. And so while all of that has been on paper, and USAID has worked very hard with the Mexican government very much in the lead to try to ensure that implementing legislation has been in place in each of the states to carry out that reform, that is obviously the easiest part because now you have the laws on the books, but in terms of the cultural change that is actually required to get all the individual actors in that system, including those who had been part of the old system, to go from a system where your judge is the same as your prosecutor to a system where, in fact, you have to go and make the tough decisions about which cases you're actually going to prioritize, and then build those cases, work on forensics, as my colleague mentioned, and try to build the strongest evidence that you can to achieve those convictions. The issue as we see it is a structural and a systemic one. It's not necessarily the judicial reforms that are needed at this point. Obviously, there could be some tweaks here and there, but it's reform of a system which requires actually working with the actors that are in that system to work together. So in terms of the evolution of our approach and what we have done differently, in the rule of law space, whereas in the beginning, as I said, our work was mostly focused on helping at the state level to ensure the implementing legislation was in place, the next phase for us was classroom training for all of the individuals. So that's judges, defense attorneys, prosecutors, investigators, et cetera. And we've realized that classroom training, while helpful, was not enough. What we needed to do was actually accompany, provide targeted assistance to actually bring these actors together. And the examples that I mentioned earlier in terms of the increases in prosecutions were a result of a very deliberate effort to bring all of those actors around the table. There's a tradition in Mexico in the judicial system where one part of it sends a letter to the other part of it. They're in receipt of the letter, and 1 month later, maybe they will respond, as opposed to just picking up the telephone or being co-located, for example, prosecutors and investigators, to build more effective cases and move them through the system. So one thing, as I said, has been moving from that classroom training to hands-on technical assistance. Within the crime and violence space, that we've had an evolution where at the beginning, there might have been a thought, okay, let's go to the violent areas and provide opportunity to underprivileged communities, and that will probably reduce violence. Well, in fact, the evidence shows that that is not a very successful approach. Instead, what you need to do is target more effectively who are those individuals that are most likely to be perpetrators of crime or victims of crime. Consider those your at-risk communities and actually look at the interventions that work most effectively. So that might be cognitive behavioral therapy, family-based counseling, a variety of mechanisms, bringing the different parts together, and that is what we're doing, and that's where we're seeing results. And on the municipal model, we're pleased to see that the government of Mexico has taken that civic justice model that I mentioned before, that we piloted in Escobedo and in Morelia, and that they've scaled that up beyond that to different parts of the country.
What how's the recidivism rate been affected by those programs of the family counseling and things you're talking about?
So in the case of our work with at-risk youth, as I mentioned, we work with youth who are in prison and are likely to be released sometime in the next 5 years. And we will work with them to give them the kind of training, life skills, and then once they come out, the vocational education to better reintegrate into society. And we are seeing their recidivism rates of just over 3% as compared to the 60% national rate.
That's really great to hear. One last quick thing. What's the contribution of the United States versus Mexico under the Merida Agreement?
So I wouldn't be able to tell you across every element of it. I don't know if my colleagues have that information. I would say at the local level in terms of security on a regular basis, on an annual basis, at least USAID's contribution is around 40 million, about 37 to 40 million per year. And I know local security contributions are on the average of about 400 million.
Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman Rooney. Congressman Vargas?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. I apologize for my voice today. It's a bit raspy. I think most of us here, really all of us here on the dais, want to see a very successful Mexico. In fact, interestingly, most of the Congress voted in favor of USMCA and see Mexico not only as a good neighbor, but obviously as a fellow partner in trade. However, there obviously are some problems. Mr. Glenn, you said, I believe, the current statistics make it hard to say that we're making headway. So I guess my question would be, should we shift our approach or strategy under the Merida Initiative? I mean, if the statistics are what they are, I mean, and they're pretty horrific, should we do something different?
Absolutely. And I think we are. We've learned from the 12 years of experience that we have. We also have a new Mexican administration that is focusing on different areas. And we will go along as far as we can to support those efforts of the current Mexican administration. I think the focus on going after the illicit finance in a larger, greater, more focused way, it will be a major shift that will give us the kinds of results that we seek. Focus on arms trafficking and helping the Mexican government, at least from our end, from our foreign assistance end of arms trafficking, helping the government of Mexico position equipment that we've donated previously so that they can protect their border and scan for guns and money coming south. So shifting those kinds of resources and that kind of focus can help change the way that we focus the Merida Initiative resources that we have.
Okay, one of the concerns I have is one of the shifts that we've seen also, or the creation of this National Guard, where I believe 25,000 of them now are being used to prevent Central American migration. I mean, that concerns me. I thought that they were supposed to be out there interdicting drugs and doing all these other things against the narco-traffickers, not against Central American migrants. I do want to ask you also about MPP, or the Migrant Protection Program, or what we normally call the Remain in Mexico. 59,000 migrants have been returned to Mexico, and as of December 31st, 2019, there are at least public reports, that 816 of these migrants have become victims of violent crimes, such as rape, kidnapping, and torture after being attacked and returned to Mexico. Now, that doesn't seem to me then it's very safe to return to Mexico when we see the statistics. Why are we continuing with this? Mr. Rodriguez.
Thank you, Congressman. You raise an excellent point. The levels of violence in Mexico are of great concern to us, as is the violence that migrants face along the entire route of the journey. And one of our efforts has been to share responsibility, to look for partners to help us in addressing the irregular migration and helping to build capacity, particularly in Central America at this point, for offering asylum and offering support closer to the home, closer to the point of departure of these migrants, so that they don't have to undertake both the dangerous journey and including the dangerous conditions in Mexico. The government of Mexico has owned the concerns that we have about the levels of violence, particularly in the northern tier of Mexico. They have committed to us to provide the same protections to the migrants as they do to their citizens, to U.S. citizens that are traveling in the area as well. Obviously,
But I guess that's my point. I mean, the statistics don't prove out that it's safe for their own citizens. I mean, Tijuana, I live in San Diego, one of the safest, largest cities in the United States. Across the border in Tijuana, they have the murder capital of the world. And yet a lot of the migrants that are sent to Tijuana, they're not from Tijuana, experience this incredible level of violence against them. I mean, when you say they're returned and they're going to provide safety as they do for their own citizens, well, it's not safe. That's the whole point.
I agree with you, sir. The levels of violence are of tremendous concern, and I think the government of Mexico shares that concern and is appropriately focused on it, but this is a large-scale problem. We assist through the Merida Initiative in the ways that we can, but again, my understanding from the government of Mexico is that they understand the problem and are focused on it.
My time has expired. The only thing I'd like to add is I'm not sure about this hugs thing either, that the new president says hugs instead of bullets. I'm not sure that's going to work. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. Congressman Yoho?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you all being here, and I want to thank you for the work that your agencies do, because I know you do it with a good intention, and you put forth everything in the teams that are with you. But yet, this is my 8th year in Congress, and I hear the same thing over and over again: good governance. We're working on rule of law, going after increasing the judicial system and all that. But yet, we're not seeing it. And Mr. Glenn, you brought that up. I think you said, under no illusion, that we have decreased the drug trafficking and flow, I think is what you were saying. And we know that. We know there's more drugs coming in. I want to look, I like to look at things as, what is the solution? How do we change this? Ms. Feinstein, you were talking about there was a 3% reduction, or 3% recidivism versus the 60% in the programs. How long have you tracked that? Is that within a year? Is that a 5-year period or a 10-year period, that 3%? And do they stay reformed and not go back into illicit activities?
Sir, I can get you the specifics on that, but my understanding is that it is a multi-year effort, that we are not just tracking people when they come out, because clearly that wouldn't be a good indication of whether recidivism is actually taking place.
No, that would be a skewed number, and that's what we don't want reported. So I don't know, is there a report out there that will say this is a 3% recidivism after 6 months, after a year, after 5 years?
Absolutely, I can get that for you.
If you could get that, that would help us, because that gives us, the programs that are working that we can bolster. You're also saying that a 40% increase in convictions, and I forget what area it was, Chihuahua or somewhere, but you were saying that the 40% increase in sentencing or conviction. What about the sentencing and the reform side of that? Or do they get pardoned or get early release? Do we know what happens? Because you can go ahead and convict them, but what happens after that? Do you have any idea?
Certainly. So the specifics that I was mentioning for the 47% was our support to specialized homicide units, and that's in a series of states I can read to you or not, where we've increased the number of indictments. So that was indictments for homicides. My other statistic was in terms of prosecutions of felony crimes. So in terms of prosecutions, that's obviously a variety of ways that could be resolved. It could result in incarceration. It could result in alternative dispute resolution, plea bargaining. So a variety of different methods. I think the challenge with the Mexican judicial sector is that under this new system, as you I'm sure are aware, in any criminal justice system, whether in our system or any system around the world, criminal justice systems only have the capacity to process about 10% of the crimes that are coming in. So you have to make strategic decisions about how you are going to prioritize. You could have a prosecutor that goes after the easiest crimes and then kind of juices their rate.
Well, that's
what we're
the stuff
trying
we
to
need to
do
look
is
at.
look at the most serious crimes. So in this case, taking all these different elements, bringing them together and asking, what is it that would really make a difference for the community, for people in Mexico, looking at serious crimes like homicides, like home invasions, armed robberies, et cetera, not the easy ones, and then look for, and for us, it is not a sign, this has been a cultural change issue also in Mexico, where people want to see folks behind bars and not necessarily look at plea bargaining or other issues.
I appreciate it. Mr. Glenn, you were talking about you don't work with the local law enforcement for obvious reasons. I want you to state what those obvious reasons are.
I think it's recognized by the Mexican government itself that the level of corruption at the local level is
and we know that, and I just want that on the record, because we have put so much money into these programs, but yet the results aren't there. I want to switch over to another question. The GAO reports show that 70% of the guns seized in Mexico by Mexican authorities come from America. What do we do when do we track that to find out who they came from here in America? And if so, what do we do? Do we have extradition laws that allow that person to go to Mexico if those guns were involved in a crime?
So we do work closely with the government of Mexico to track those guns. ATF is present at the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City, and in the cases where we have tracking information, where there are serial numbers on the guns, there's cooperation to share that with U.S. law enforcement so that we can track back.
Have we sent our people down there that have been,
We have U.S. law enforcement officials in Mexico.
no, the person that broke the law here selling the guns, have we sent them to Mexican prisons for their judicial system?
I would have to check with DOJ on specific cases. I can't recall off the top of my head cases, but that doesn't mean that.
Would that be a strong deterrent if we did?
I would assume it would be a very
think
strong
so.
deterrent. Yes, sir.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. Congressman Dean Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Rooney, and to our witnesses. We had a similar hearing about a month ago relative to aid to Mexico, and not surprisingly, corruption took center stage. So I'd like to begin with a question to you, Mr. Glenn, and you, Ms. Feinstein, about how corruption very specifically impacts your work, starting with you, Mr. Glenn. And if you can be specific about corruption, not general.
Corruption, so our focus is on improving law enforcement. And so our focus, our anti-corruption efforts in the past and going forward as well, will be on how do we eliminate or how do we help the Mexican government eliminate corruption within their public security forces.
But can you talk about that? I want to hear specifically about that corruption in the security forces.
Sure, but I think we have at least the alleged conduct of the former head of the federal police, Garcia Luna, who was arrested recently, I believe, in Dallas. He was, at the time that I was in Mexico, one of our principal interlocutors. So obviously that shakes the trust that we have, but we in order to do the work that we do, we have to work with those who the government of Mexico has in place. We do our best to vet. Not only do we do the Leahy vetting that's on the human rights side, but we also do the internal vetting to make sure that, to the best of our knowledge, our partners are with us and not against us.
And if we uncover troubling information, do they act on it, our Mexican partners?
To the extent that I know, yes.
Okay. All right, thank you.
If I could just jump in.
Sure, Mr. Rodriguez. Yeah.
I know that Mexico has created an independent federal prosecutor for corruption crimes, and they've moved to remove immunity from elected officials who engage in corruption, and they established the National Anti-Corruption System. President Lopez Obrador ran on a platform of targeting and persecuting corrupt officials. We learned yesterday that the former head of Pemex was arrested in Spain based on a request by the government of Mexico for alleged corruption involving Odebrecht. So they are pursuing corruption in both current and former government officials.
Okay. And Ms. Feinstein, specifically, in your work, how does corruption affect?
Sure. So corruption, anti-corruption is one of the areas that we have as a focus for our work in Mexico because of the toll that it takes on the Mexican state at every level where that's encountered by individuals on a day-to-day basis, and as well as businesses. For example, corruption is estimated to cost the Mexican government, or Mexico, between 5 to 9% of its GDP. So it's obviously an enormous problem for the private sector and for individuals on a day-to-day basis. Complementing what my colleagues have said, one of the areas of work that USAID engages in is looking at the procurement process in Mexico, since a lot of the historic corruption scandals in Mexico have related to government procurement. And so what we've done is to provide the tools so that a spotlight can be shined on where corruption is going on with regard to sole source procurement, for example, and have invested in blockchain analysis of the weaknesses in the procurement process, and we are working with specific states on a demand-driven basis to help them look at vulnerabilities in their procurement system so that they can make those changes.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Mr. Rodriguez, another line of questioning here. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov recently announced that Mexico was in talks to purchase Russian-made helicopters. If that were to proceed, would it risk sanctions by the United States under Section 231 of the CATSA Act?
Thank you, Congressman. We have looked into that. We obviously saw that readout of the meeting between Foreign Minister Lavrov and Foreign Secretary Ebrard. We read it with great interest, and it is concerning to us. Based on our initial investigation, it appears that such a sale would trigger potentially sanctions under CATSA. And we don't have further specifics for you this morning, but I'd be happy to give you a fuller readout on that when we have it.
Have we made our position clear to our Mexican friends?
I believe we have at the embassy level, and I'll need to check on that to confirm. But at the Washington level, we have raised this as an area of concern with our counterparts in Mexico City to raise with the government of Mexico.
Okay, we'd appreciate that information. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
I yield my time.
Thank you, Congressman. Congressman Ken Buck.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Feinstein, I want to ask you a quick question. You mentioned that the different ways that we are trying to protect journalists. Could you just go through those really quickly again? I remember a panic button. By the way, who does the panic button, who answers the panic button on the other side? I hope not the corrupt law enforcement that we just heard about.
So this is through the National Protection Mechanism, which is something that we as USAID helped the government of Mexico to establish in the previous
I asked you, who
administration.
answers it on the other side?
It is officials associated with the National Protection Mechanism, which are vetted police, vetted law enforcement, who will then redirect that
And
accordingly
have you
to
measured the
authorities.
response time of those folks?
So I think we recognize that this is not a foolproof mechanism. And so if, for example, you are a journalist and someone is with you, someone is trying to kill you and has therefore been in your presence, no call from a panic button is going to result in law enforcement coming and bailing you out immediately, which is why
Do you know what
panic
would?
button-
I was in law enforcement for 25 years, and there were a lot of people that didn't like me. Just like being a congressman, there are a lot of people that don't like me now. But I did have a gun. Are we training these folks in the use of firearms?
Not to the best of my knowledge. I
Would
believe
that be a more efficient, I mean, if it takes 15 minutes for someone to show up and you got 20 seconds to react, would that be a more efficient way or more effective way of trying to help folks?
So I would refer you to technical experts on this. I'm not an expert in law enforcement, so you clearly have more expertise in this area than I do. What I will say is a panic button is one of a variety of mechanisms that are provided. We also provide support so that there are residential security upgrades that are as necessary, protection teams, et cetera. So it's not just the panic button. And I think with some exceptions, obviously, this has been successful in terms of protecting journalists and keeping them alive. I think our hope would be that there are more resources invested in this mechanism so that it can be expanded to provide greater protection, which we would prefer not to have to do, but is a reality in Mexico today.
I think someone just handed you a note. They may have told you whether you guys give them guns or not.
No, in fact, that was an answer to Mr. Yoho's question
Oh, okay.
on the recidivism rate, which we track for 12 to 18 months afterwards.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mr. Rodriguez, I wanted to know about the flow of drugs across the border and what the Mexican government is doing. My understanding is that they have enhanced military or law enforcement presence along the border. Is that correct?
If I could, Congressman, I'd like to pass this to Rich because the programs, the cooperative programs that we have with the government of Mexico really fall under his area of expertise.
So the interdiction responsibility lies with multiple agencies within the government of Mexico. The military is one of those. The National Guard is increasingly taking on that role.
And I'm specifically asking about the border area. Is there enhanced security, military, law enforcement on the border area?
There is enhanced focus on borders, both on the Mexican southern border as well as Mexico's northern border.
And what is happening as a result of that? What result do we see?
Well, I mean, in increased amounts of seizures, we see greater success with the equipment that we've donated to them, whether it's hard equipment or the canines that I mentioned earlier. We've also been trying to get them to focus and cooperate more on ports So ports, the influx or importation of precursor chemicals.
How much money have we given to Mexico in the last 10 years to assist in this, and why is it that we are asking them to help with ports? Is there obviously some incentive for them to help with ports?
Sure.
Do they also help with physical barriers along the southern, or our southern border, their northern border?
Yeah. Let me touch first on the amount of money that we've spent over the last 10, 12 years specifically on border security, and that can be ports, it can be seaports, land ports. We've spent about $200 million on equipment and training. So that's non-intrusive inspection equipment, canines.
And I'm wondering about Mexico. How much money do they spend? Are they paying for a wall, I guess is the question.
Are they paying for a wall? A physical wall, not that I know of, but in terms of personnel dedicated to screening and protecting to protecting the border, yes, they've deployed. I don't know a specific number on how much money they've spent.
I'll yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. Congressman Joaquin Castro.
Thank you, Chairman. Under the migrant protection protocols, thousands of vulnerable people, asylum seekers, are forced to live in dangerous conditions in Mexico due to the Trump administration's policies as they await their asylum claims. I recently, along with 16 other members of Congress, visited the border, and I saw firsthand the conditions of disarray and fear, and came away believing that it's an inhumane situation that we're placing these folks in. Mexican border towns have become incredibly dangerous, and migrants have become victims of violent crime, including kidnapping, robbery, and rape, as they languish at the border. So my question for y'all is, do you know how many individuals are currently in Mexico under the Trump administration's Remain in Mexico policy, awaiting adjudication of their asylum claims?
Congressman Castro, I don't know that I have that number right in front of me, but if you will permit me, I'll be happy to get that number back to you, if I could take that.
Okay. Do you believe that these people along the border are actually safe in that environment?
Safe is, well, let me put it this way. We and the government of Mexico are working to increase their safety. So our Bureau of Refugees and Migration works with international organizations such as UNHCR and IOM to provide support to migrants under the MPP program. And to that extent, we are working directly to try to provide support and safety to those individuals, as well as encouraging and working with the government of Mexico to provide support and safety to those individuals as well.
Well, the State Department acknowledges that some of those Mexican cities are cities that the State Department has advised Americans not to travel to.
Yes, sir.
Because of the danger of those cities.
Yes, sir.
What steps is the State Department and USAID taking to protect these people as they pursue their asylum claims?
I'll let Barbara talk about USAID, and I will only add that my understanding from DHS colleagues is that the period of time that these individuals are waiting in Mexico for their asylum hearings and the processing is meant to be as expedited as possible.
And I guess based on what we heard from folks the other day, is quite the opposite, which is courts in the United States are bringing these folks in for court dates and then setting a reset court date 3 or 4 months later, basically hoping that people will either stay in Mexico or just go away. So the folks that do remain there are being subject to these very dangerous conditions, threatening conditions. But I've got just about 1 minute and 40 seconds left, unless you wanted to say something about USAID.
No, just to mention that this is actually not within USAID's mandate in Mexico. It is, as Das Rodriguez mentioned, with the Population, Refugees, and Migration Bureau of the State Department. So we are not engaging in that area of work.
I mean, it sounds like this is more in the wheelhouse of USAID than some of the work that you've been describing for the last hour.
So specifically in terms of how the U.S. government handles migration, that is primarily within PRM, within the State Department's bureau. And so the work on asylum strengthening, for example, is not something that USAID engages in. That's something that PRM does.
You talked about the reform of Mexico's legal system or justice system. Do they have a public defender system or indigent defense system there?
We do, and through our work, we work with public defenders, with the defense attorneys at the state level primarily.
And how extensive is that system now? Is it nationwide? Is it
Yeah, so it is
built out?
part of the, it was part of the judicial reform law, or whole change to the justice system in terms of presumption of innocence rather than presumption of guilt, and that has now been implemented in every single state. That being said, there are some states that are a lot more mature that are progressing more effectively in that than others.
Let me ask you one last question, which is, there are a lot of fully automatic, actually, and semi-automatic weapons that are trafficked to Mexico from the United States. Does the United States government fund or help Mexico retrieve those guns? Not just track the serial numbers, but actually go get them.
Under the Merit Initiative, we have aided and assisted the government of Mexico in the form of primarily recovering and being able to track weapons, so through serial number, through the forensics. ATF is present in the embassy and does work with the Attorney General's office, with state-level Attorney General's offices, to retrieve weapons that have been used in the committing of crimes, to then be able to track them back to the United States and hopefully find who it is that bought them and how they've come across the border.
Thanks. Everybody.
Congressman Vicente Gonzalez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a few questions. I'm certainly concerned about the trade routes to my district and the violence on those roads. Being that Mexico last year had, if you consider the confirmed murders and disappearances, the number exceeds every soldier we lost during Vietnam, and this is just in 1 year. Being that the violence is to this extreme, are we, and Mexico being our #1 trading partner, are we having the conversation that this could potentially be a national security threat if we have a failed state or portions of the country are failed? In my opinion, they already are in certain states. Are we having those conversations with Mexico?
Thank you, Congressman Gonzalez. We do have conversations every day about the security threats to Mexican citizens and U.S. citizens, and the fact that this obviously represents a national security concern both for Mexico and for the U.S. So yes, sir, we do have those conversations. We are talking about that.
Being that Mexico's homicide rate has skyrocketed over the past few years, and we've also witnessed a series of issues of impunity in prosecuting crimes, especially those committed against American citizens in Mexico. Recently, we've had, just in the past few months, I can recall about 11 deaths of American citizens on Mexican soil. Are we doing anything to try to extradite those individuals who are found to be the perpetrators of those crimes?
Let me speak specifically to the horrific murder of 9 American citizens in Sonora at the end of 2019. President
Chihuahua,
Trump,
right? Wasn't it Chihuahua? Was it the Mormon family?
it was Bavispe, Sonora, on the border with Chihuahua.
Okay.
President Lopez Obrador, in his conversation with President Trump, agreed to a joint investigation involving the FBI, and that investigation has been ongoing, and I would urge you to talk to FBI about where they are with that. So there are conversations and joint investigations going on addressing the homicides. I also recognize, as you mentioned, that the homicide rate has been going up. Specifically since 2014, it has grown up every year. This is a problem that the Lopez Obrador administration inherited and has been very focused on. It's going to take a great deal of effort to bend that curve, but they are working on that, and I can turn it over to ask Glenn to talk about some of the efforts we provide under Merida to help professionalize investigations and prosecutions.
I could speak specifically quickly to extraditions and the assistance that we provide through the Merit Initiative. Extradition.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I want to know about extraditions on crimes perpetrated against Americans in Mexico. And I know that we've taken a special interest on this case, but there's many others, and I'm curious if we have a concerted effort that we're actually trying to go after folks that harm American citizens in Mexico.
Attorney General Barr has traveled twice in the last 2 months to Mexico to speak with his counterparts there and to urge a focus on extraditions. The government of Mexico has responded in a very fulsome way. We have seen a large number of high-value extraditions over the course of the last 3 months, as well as a high volume of fugitives returned to the U.S. for crimes that occurred in the United States. So yes, we are getting a very fulsome response on extraditions. As far as the underlying grounds for each of those cases, I would have to defer you to DOJ. I don't know if they are specific to crimes against American citizens in Mexico.
Yeah, that's the only reason I'm asking, because just the last few months, in the last 90 days, we've had at least 11 American citizens murdered in Mexico. 1 or 2 of them were from my district, so it's quite a concern. One was just on the bridge coming across on the Mexican side, and we had a 13-year-old kid get shot, and these 9, and this is just what I know of. I don't have any more confirmations from the State Department, but it certainly is a concern. Thank you for your testimony.
You're welcome. If I might just add, if I could just take one more minute. I'm a career consular officer with the Foreign Service, and I've spent a good deal of my career working in Mexico and on Mexico issues. With regard to the safety of American citizens, we take it very seriously. We are immediately engaged when an American citizen is either injured or something more grave happens to them in Mexico. And I can tell you from my experience, the Mexican government and their consular function kicks in to work very closely in tandem with us in those cases. So in terms of cooperation, in my experience over the past 20 years, it has been very comprehensive. And speaking once more to extraditions, I think we've had something north of 30 high-value extraditions in the past 90 days.
Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. Well, thank you all for being here. Today is an important hearing. Reducing violence and insecurity in Mexico is no easy task. But I hope that my colleagues and I can work more closely in the coming months with the executive branch to evaluate our assistance to Mexico and improve our strategic approach towards Mexico. I thank the witnesses and all the members for being here today. With that, the committee is adjourned.